so much to be marveled in this day and age. Every road has been followed, every mistake's been made, but there's a lot to be desired, and I find myself inside memories still alive just behind my eyes. Seems the more I go, leaving home, looking for what I need's been buried in my soul. 'Cause I never heard a song sung quite like Elvis. Not much beats the sound of the pouring rain, and there's something in your kiss leaves me so helpless. You leave me breathless. You leave me breathless. So there's this voice inside, terrified, plagued with pride, resonating, sounding like my own. Then piece by piece, so suddenly, no subtleties, your beauty, it can bring me to my knees. 'Cause I never heard a song sung quite like Elvis. Not much beats the sound of the pouring rain, and there's something in your kiss leaves me so helpless. You leave me breathless. You leave me breathless. I'm always wishing on the times we had, wishing I could get you back. Always wishing on the times we had, wishing I could get you back. 'Cause I never heard a song sung quite like Elvis. Not much beats the sound of the pouring rain, and there's something in your kiss leaves me so helpless, and I can't help but see you again. And I can never see the sunrise too many times. Fall asleep with you under the northern lights, and there's something in your touch leaves me so helpless. You leave me breathless. You leave me breathless.
Go ahead and get started, Brian.
Okay, welcome everybody. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping tips. We are building a community. Please introduce yourself in the chat and let your fellow participants know your name, tribal affiliation, job title, and organization. Everyone will be muted until the audience participation section at the end. You'll raise your hand and we'll unmute you. And then at the end, you'll receive a link to the recording and presentation by the end of the week. And continuing education information, this activity is jointly provided by United South and Eastern Tribes and Cardia Services. And then the requirements, you will be completing the entire activity by staying to the end and completing the online evaluation that we will send in the chat and submitting an online CE request within 2 weeks of the event. And if you have any questions about the CE activity, contact Paige O'Sullivan at the email address on the screen or her phone number. And there are no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies for those involved with the ability to control the content of this activity.
Hi, good morning or afternoon for some of you. I just want to welcome you for today's Reclaiming series, Echo. Otakue Oyase, we are related. My name is Bernice Jordan. I am a citizen of the Fort Peck Sioux Nation. I'm a public health program manager here at USET. Next slide. You are on Indigenous land. We want you to learn and acknowledge that you are an organization or standing on. If you would go ahead and text this number or go to this website, you will be able to locate where you're at. Next slide. Our Reclaiming Community Growth. We are connecting our Indigenous community. This data is from the 2023 registration. So every red dot it's not just a person, it's a collaborative effort of each and every person that from across the nation. Thank you for being a part of Reclaiming for our collective stories. Next slide. So as we move forward, I want to introduce you to Ms. Holly Echohawk, and she will be presenting next.
Hi, everybody. Holly Echohawk here. I'm happy to see everybody. We're continuing our monthly series, and today I'm really thrilled to introduce briefly Dr. Brett Copland. Dr. Copland is a friend of our series, and we're really happy to have him back. You'll remember he did part 1 of this presentation last month, and he's going to continue today with part 2. And he is one of the few Native child psychiatrists in the country. And we're just thrilled to have him, and he'll tell you a little bit more, introduce himself, but I want to turn it over to Dr. Copland.
Hamatakyab, Lila Dayan, Yahipi na Lila Dayan wa Chiankapi. Hi, relatives. It's very good to see all of you. I'm glad you're here. I'm Brett Copland, Brett Copland Amatchiab. I'll introduce myself a little bit in Lakota. I didn't grow up speaking Lakota. I'm sure as those listening that grew up speaking or talk better than I will be able to tell just by hearing me talk. So I'll start off with a little bit of introduction in Lakota. Brett Amatchiab, ma Lakota na oyati mitawa ki si chanhu iwichakiapi. Rose bado yanki el omawapi eash California makabashbe el matrumpi na Michigan makabashbe el imachaje. Wana Rochester, Minnesota atumahe el mahasani kichiwati. Na Mayo Clinic child psychiatrist Wawashia Chamun. Na child psychiatrist Yapiki Wenetu Wikchemnanum Sam Saptan Hehanyan Wawashia Chamun. Lakol Wichohan ki Otrehike Eash Lakol Wichohan Lena ki Triwahila. lila te wachila na matakia chante washtea nape chiuzepalo. So I'm Brett Copland. I'm a child psychiatrist. I think my title is Ikche Wachasha. Just a regular person. And I'm a child psychiatrist here at Mayo Clinic. I've been here, I think I've been a child psychiatrist for getting close to 25 years. You know, my opinions in this talk are my own and not that of my employer. So I'm enrolled at Rosebud, and I didn't grow up there. I was born in California and then grew up in Michigan. And I live here in Rochester, Minnesota with my Mahasani, my wife. And I love the Lakota ways, and it's with a warm, from my heart, I shake everybody's hand. So thank you for being here, everybody. I'm going to start off with a really quick prayer in Lakota, and then we'll go into the talk. So we sort of start off in a good way. Tunkashala dakushkanshkan na tatuya dopa na unshimaka daku iuhacha umayakie he lila wopila tranka echichia yo wana yotie wakie cha unshimala yo ho hichituwelo mitakia yasin. So we'll get started. Let me just make sure I don't have any food on my face. I know this is being recorded, so. All right, well, today we're going to talk, this is sort of part 2 of a talk I gave about a month ago, and I'm going to review a little bit from that previous talk today. I'll run through it pretty quickly. This talk will focus more on really with trauma, adverse events, how we can cope with that, but we may get out of balance. And today we'll be focusing a little bit more on that physical, biologic part of the aspect of ourselves, and how that may get out of balance with repetitive adverse events or trauma. So next slide, I'll start in with a little bit of review. So now I'm going to say this, you'll get tired of me hearing this, from the Lakota perspective. So I'll be saying that a lot. So Lakota Chohan is like the Lakota life or way. And again, I'm not like, again, a little bit of a caveat. I didn't grow up speaking Lakota. I'm not like a authority on Lakota culture. I work as more of a clinician. And again, this is just my, trying to be a little bit more humble perspective on, sort of aspects of trauma and how we may think about these. But from resiliency from Lakota Chohan Etahan, from that sort of way of thinking, that Lakota people survived through many ages, being able to adapt to change. Since Mitaku Yasin means we're all related, then when change occurs, it affects everything around us. So it means we're all related, not only to each other, but to the earth, to different animal nations. To survive means being able to adapt in a healthy way to a new situation at hand by establishing our sort of position among the what's above us, the 4 directions, grandmother earth below us. So then we're the sort of establishing our 7th direction. And as long as we can keep a balance in our direction and use the Lakota thought process, we can adapt and survive anything. This is said by David Little Elk from Cheyenne River, Washtewak Pala, I think he's from. Next slide. So in the Lakota thought process, again, I'm reviewing a little bit from last time, but we think of the sort of like almost like the 4 directions. So Lakol Wawayukchan, sort of like Lakota thought or Lakota Wawayukchan. So there's the 4 areas that we need to keep in balance are sort of emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual. And we get sort of lost if one of those areas is a little bit out of balance. And today it's going to be focusing a little bit more on the physical aspects of keeping those things in balance. Next slide. Let's see, is everybody, just double checking before I start here, is everybody able to hear me okay? Okay, good. Let me just change my view a little bit. There we go. Trying to not to take up too much time, but I was going to say I was so I'm enrolled at Rosebud, and I was talking to someone the other day from Pine Ridge, and humor is an important aspect of how we cope with things. And he said to me, he right away he started off with a joke, and he said to me, and he's from Pine Ridge, so I don't live at Rosebud, I didn't grow up there, but I'm enrolled there, and he knew that. So he says right away, he goes, Brett, Tunkashala, gave us, he was talking about Pine Ridge Oglalas. Tunkashala gave us Tashunke Witko, which is crazy horse. And he gave you Rosebudders Highway 18. And it's just the highway that runs through Rosebud there. So it's just teasing me. So I don't know if that's that funny. I tell my wife these jokes, and she goes, well, that's not funny. And I always think like they're really funny. So I don't know. But things said in Lakota are usually much funnier. I don't know why that is, but it just is. So usually in starting in sort of talking about the physical aspects of stress and adversity, stress responses are usually how we adapt, how we're resilient. So when we're stressed in a scary situation, the physical aspects of stress, not only our emotions, but our physical aspects, our heart rate goes up, our breathing goes up. It's that sort of fight or flight sort of response. So that's our adrenaline. And another aspect of a stress response that's normal and helps us cope, helps us keep us safe, is our body responds with a hormone or chemical called cortisol. And cortisol in the short term, well, even if we give cortisol to treat, arthritis, and we give cortisol, and a person has asthma, arthritis, it's an anti-inflammatory. So sometimes cortisol is given as a medication. Some of the side effects we'll see with cortisol are alterations in blood sugar, weight gain, blood pressure changes, those sort of things. It can be very helpful, though, to prevent sort of inflammation, but it's part of the normal stress response. And these things sort of help us keep us safe. Heart rate goes up so we can run away, get out of danger, right? Next slide. So I want to start with an illustration of that fight or flight response, and how theories on how the brain what's going on in the brain really. But I want to start with, and I mentioned sort of a repeat of the previous talk, that there's we call Inktomi stories in Lakota. Historically, these stories were always told, usually during the winter, I think at night. There's a little bit of snow out here, so I guess it's still sort of winter, so maybe we're okay. Kitanla Wahine, there's a little bit of snow. But Ohunkakan is like an old story, and I've heard this is so long ago, it's a time when animals could talk, but this is a Inktomi story. And I want to use this to illustrate some things about our brain, theories about the brain. So Inktomi in Lakota history is sort of like a trickster. Lakota and Inktomi in the old story was sort of, he made a pact or an agreement with coyotes or wolves. So in stories, sometimes he'll, when talking to other animals, Inktomi, this trickster, will be a coyote, or a old word for coyote is yashle. Usually we don't say that anymore, but yashle and matro. So it's a story about the coyote and the bear. And in this story, the coyote, who's really Inktomi, this trickster, this coyote has a knife, and he threatens this bear, and the bear gets scared and runs off. So it's sort of interesting that this coyote is able to scare off this bear, but that's sort of, this bear is running off and scared. Next slide. So to illustrate how the brain works, so the coyote, the brain, the picture of the brain, there's a bear there. So the bear is seeing the coyote. So sometimes in a scary situation, we won't even think about it, and something will happen that scares us, like we see what we think is a rattlesnake or something, or something startles us, and we just jump or move out of the way without even thinking. And what's theorized to sort of happen there is those fear signals sort of go to an area in the brain called the amygdala that recognizes those as a scary situation. The amygdala, without us even consciously thinking about it, will signal the body, like those are supposed to be pictures of kidneys there, because the adrenaline and cortisol comes right from an area right by the kidneys. So that amygdala sort of triggers the fear response, this immediate quick response to run away. So adrenaline is released, our heart rate goes up, and we get out of the way. So that's a really fast pathway. This is really felt to be probably an older part of the brain, sort of, so to speak. So this is a very normal response, right? This can keep us safe. Next slide. This is sort of a different way of responding. So in this one, when the bear sees a coyote, this is a slower pathway. And some of these fear signals may go to our thinking areas of the brain that sort of think through this and then say, well, I'm a bear. I really shouldn't be scared, Kawakipi, shni, I'm not scared. Gene Yashle, because it's just a coyote. So the bear can sort of think through this and then sort of modulate consciously those responses. But this is a slower pathway, and so a lot of times we don't always get a chance to sort of think through stressful situations. And we may have a reaction that we just don't have a lot of control over. Next slide. And there's a third response, is sort of freezing in a traumatic or scary situation, where the body just freezes and the heart rate actually slows down, so that amygdala sort of does the opposite. Instead of releasing adrenaline, it sort of causes you to be still and freeze. And that's another fast response that we may not have a lot of control over. And people sometimes feel, guilty or bad when they don't respond to something. They just sort of freeze, but that's, something we may not have a lot of control over. Next slide. So these are all normal responses that help keep us safe. And again, I'm focusing more on these 4 aspects of physical responses, like what happens with our brain or the theories behind it. Now, when stresses become chronic, or it's a severe stress, we're sort of overloaded, and our body can't go back into balance, the cortisol response sort of gets out of balance. Where our body may be more sort of sensitive to further stresses. So with our cortisol being out of balance, we can see this being linked to cardiovascular disease, autoimmune diseases, asthma, poor wound healing, and sort of felt to be this cortisol dysregulation. And I don't think we always think about these aspects, but when we look at adverse childhood events, there's a clear link between that and these disorders as well. I mean, we can see, these are similar disorders that we would see too, likely linked to things like historical trauma as well. So it's only when this system gets out of balance, the cortisol gets out of balance, that leads to higher sensitivity. Next slide. Now, in a similar way, we can think of generational trauma, and I talked in the previous talk about how aspects of generational trauma are felt to be theoretically, maybe inherited, not exactly as our DNA, but our DNA may be sort of affected in ways called epigenetics, where if our ancestors experienced trauma in some ways, there are some issues that we may sort of inherit, but there's also maybe, if we can inherit different things, we can inherit resilience as well and strength as well, I would think. Next slide. So when we talk about, immediate trauma, but we also talk about historical trauma, where, we're thinking in the definition of historical trauma by Maria Braveheart, aspects of survivor guilt, self-destructive behaviors, physical symptoms, and we talked about those, safety, suicidal concerns, different aspects of historical trauma, emotional aspects. Next slide. So from a Lakota perspective, from that Lakota way of thinking, for Indigenous health, standards are defined by centuries of ancestral consciousness among Indigenous people across generations, in spite of settler colonial systems that do not serve them. In other words, Indigenous culture as health practices contribute to self-determination, sovereignty, and liberation. So incorporating these strategies will ameliorate problems related to white supremacy and health. So again, those, looking at our own ways of practices and healing and remaining in balance are really important to incorporate in approaches to helping or improving sort of this balance of trauma or generational trauma or even acute trauma as well, when we think about trying to get people back into balance. Next slide. And one of the ways of thinking about when we think about different interventions, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, some general concepts of some of the, today we'll focus a little bit more too. In a little bit, I'm going to talk about some interventions that we can use where we can sort of help the body self-regulate and put it back in balance. And these are going to be particularly helpful in situations where we can't always talk about specifically some of the traumas, or we're not able to, but yet our body sort of holds these memories and responses, and how we can help put things back in balance or self-regulate. So when we think of interventions, there was a study by Johns Hopkins Center for Native Health that looked at a Culture Forward project, and it was really focused more on youth, help improve, youth suicide concerns, but they looked at qualitative interviews in 36 diverse tribal communities. And these were some of the core themes with the community stakeholders that came up that would help as an intervention. Some general thoughts. So our networks harness belonging and keep us safe. Connections to our lands and elders allow us to thrive. Traditional knowledge holds the keys to health and healing. Native youth lead us to reclaim our autonomy and well-being, and self-determination empowers us to fight. Next slide. Now, when thinking of interventions, this may seem unrelated, but I wanted to illustrate a point a little bit. When we think, and I'm using this as an example of, one of my interests is I'm trying to be better with my Lakota. So when we think of language, there are different agencies that want to help revitalize language. So how do we help with sort of cultural language revitalization? And the point of this slide is that if that thought or process comes from something separate from the tribal communities and isn't linked to the communities, people, and it's just extracted as knowledge. And for instance, if you sort of extract like for linguistic extraction, this is what this is talking about, sort of helping with language revitalization. So if you just sort of take the language and put it into a sort of separate sort of object really that can be collected, preserved, utilized, admired, studied, and separate from the people that use the language to relate and communicate, then it becomes something different. And this literal and metaphorical extraction from context is in itself a colonial enterprise and cornerstone of Western science that removes people from their homelands, loots objects from graves in the name of science and education of something to be studied. So when we think of interventions, that link to the coming from the communities, our tribal diversity, individuals, and just an example of this, I don't want to belabor it too long, but I think it's an important thing to think about, that when you think about interventions, this is sort of a story from someone I know and his grandmother, who was very knowledgeable, Lakota. I'm trying to think if it was at Standing Rock, very knowledgeable about medicinal plants. And outsiders had sort of come to her, non-Lakotas, to want to gain knowledge of medicinal plants, to sort of harvest them and use them, or maybe even sell them. And she thought about this, about sharing this knowledge, and and thought that, well, what happens if I share this knowledge and it's, everybody comes and digs up these plants. There maybe aren't many of them, it endangers the plants. Will our community be able to use it? Is it something extracted from our community? And was very sort of thoughtful about that process. So I just use that to illustrate a point of interventions in general. And again, I'm not an expert, and I'm sure that there's many more therapists and people from the community have better thoughts on this than I do. I just sharing a few of my thoughts from my own somewhat limited perspective. New slide. So again, so we talked about sort of historical trauma. There's another diagnosis of trauma, of PTSD, that we think of clinically. And there's very specific criteria for PTSD, including usually a very specific traumatic event, very certain number of symptoms. And we look at therapies for PTSD. There are these well-studied therapies that really are among the cornerstone of what we call cognitive behavioral therapy. Different coping skills, relaxation skills built into this. So just wanted to illustrate there are some specific treatments for PTSD, which is more of a specific diagnosis. Next slide. So how do we move forward with incorporating different interventions into, in medicine or psychiatry, I always think of sort of evidence-based practice. So how do we incorporate some of these aspects of traditional healing things that we know are helpful from a community perspective, how do we incorporate these into treatment? And not to get into, not to get off track, this is a whole nother area of discussion, but I just wanted to sort of broach this a little bit, that when we think about things like music therapy, and I'm going to talk about sort of drum music therapy, exercise, movement, breathing. I'm not going to talk about, working with horses or shunkawakan as much, but, sort of equine, animal, horse therapy. When we look at many psychiatric treatment programs, music therapy is incorporated as part of the treatment. Working with animals, visiting with animals of shunka or dogs will, be part of the sort of treatment program. Relaxation techniques of music. So these were sort of already incorporated into many of our treatment programs. But I think, and again, not to get off track too much on this, but in some of the newer types of therapy, and I'm not an expert either in acceptance and commitment therapy, it's called ACT therapy, but that can be used for a wide range of different difficulties. And from my understanding, you may not even need an exact psychiatric diagnosis to benefit from that therapy. But some of the newer therapies, looking at an individual's values and culture, can incorporate some of these aspects into the treatment plan of working towards one's values. And many of the cognitive behavioral models will incorporate relaxation therapy, exercise, these sort of things into our treatment plan. So that was just a few of my thoughts on maybe how to broach some of that. New slide. Well, let me, I know I want to get into treatment a little bit and not to get too far off on things, but I did want to mention a study by Braveheart that looked again at incorporating different aspects of, from more of a traditional perspective and traditional worldview into a treatment model. And looked at interpersonal therapy, and then one group had added other added aspects of therapy. Next slide. So in this trauma intervention therapy, one of the groups had added elements of looking at historical context, psychoeducation about trauma and grief, group processing, and then transcending trauma through experiences including traditional songs, smudging, sweetgrass or sage, and talking circles. Next slide. So in that, maybe go back one slide. Sorry about that. Yeah. So in this study, and go back one more slide. In this study, I think there was found to be a preference, particularly from a post-intervention, that both groups improved, but particularly there was qualitative observations that there were greater perceived gains among participants that had some of the added more cultural or traditional approaches to therapy. Next slide. And then go one more. And then just wanted to say a little bit more about ACT therapy, and looking at that and really being able to sort of incorporate one's values into a treatment plan too. Next slide. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. We can move ahead one more slide. I want to have enough time to talk about. So when we look at one study that looked at trauma resilience and recovery, in a higher risk population, one of the core aspects, not symptom. That's as a doctor, we need to get away from that. We're always thinking about symptoms. We have to I think, really think from a strength or a model of looking at one's strengths. But that when recovering from trauma or adversity, that purpose of life was really associated with both resilience and recovery. And Viktor Frankl, I think, talked about this too, that purpose, looking at one's values, linking to those values, those are important aspects when of resilience and recovery from trauma. New slide. I want to tell, maybe I know I'm running low on time here. I was going to tell a joke, but I don't know if I'll have time for that. It's a short joke. I'll tell you this. I was in a meeting a while ago, and the person who was leading the meeting, there was like a snoring sound in the background. And I was like, what is that? Everybody's like, and someone says, what is that noise? In fact, they said in Dakota, they said, do a copa, hey, who's snoring? They said. And the person who was leading the Zoom discussion, you couldn't see it, but her pet bulldog was sitting in her lap, and it was sleeping and snoring. And then this group Zoom meeting, and the other person says, oh, I thought it was Brett snoring. So so if I'm snoring, we're in trouble here. So let's move on pretty quickly here. So I'm going to talk about, so these are really interventions that, well, the language is certainly talking about things, but the first two interventions really focus on aspects of when we're not able to talk about things. So more like how we deal with our body's response to, being triggered by stress. When a person had a history of trauma, and then their heart rate goes up, they're having anxiety, but they're not able to really identify or talk about things. How do we get one to regulate those rhythms? Next slide. So when we look at, music therapy, that, like I said, that are, inpatient programs, music therapy is sort of part of that. Bessel van der Kolk talks about reestablishing these rhythms of movement, rhythmical engagement, regulating our breathing, regulating our physical responses when we're sort of sensitized to stress. Next slide. So drum from the Lakota perspective, the origin story of that is and I'll share a little bit of Lakota history here, which I'm always happy to do. Wakan Tanka, my understanding is, people, the sort of great mystery, but it's also felt historically like a group of entity, or a group of beings, or holy beings. It was more of a group. So this is a really way back, but there was a bear called in Lakota Hunump, and Hunump was this giant bear, and this bear was not part of the Wakan Tanka, but listened into their meetings and learned their songs and dances, these sacred songs and dances. And at that time, before people, there was a Pteoyate who would eventually become the Ikche Wachasha, Ikche Lakota people, but also the buffalo came from the Pteoyate. So that's why we're so close. But Hunum taught these sacred songs to the Pteoyate and their chief Tatanka to sing and make drums and rattles. So the Pteoyate had their first powwow, singing with drums. And one of the members of the Wakantanka, Wakian, so Wakian is thunder, a thunder being. And the Wakian, when you hear the drums, it's like thunder. And thought there was another Wakian, so went to investigate, what is that? And the Wakian heard the Pteoyate and all the good songs and dances and the drumming, and was very pleased, like, this is really good. And so part of that, the Wakian would cleanse or sort of heal the area. So when the storms come and the Wakian come, that sort of cleans the water, the storms, the lightning. So that's the healing aspect of drums, that linked to the Wakian, like the West. Next slide. And then more recently, if you get a chance to read this book, I'd really, if you're interested, in songs or drum, the Ojibwa Dance Drum is a book by Thomas Venom. And there's a really good Lakota singer and songwriter, and he is just really knowledgeable, Earl Bullhead, who also talks about this. And in part of the history, there probably a Dakota woman in the story had lost her sons, was massacred by the Milahanska, the soldiers, and she was escaping, and she hid under lily pads for 4 days. And at this time, she received a vision to make a drum, and she was taught all the songs, and she was told to teach the people how to sing the songs and to share it with other tribes. And then this drum and song would bring instrument of peace and healing to people. So next slide. So yeah, and there's a whole etiquette around the drum as well that Earl Bullhead talks about. But next slide. So in the study looking at drum-assisted recovery that incorporated some of these aspects into a substance use treatment program, that was found to be helpful as well. And it's not surprising, songs, healing songs themselves can be healing as well. Next slide. Now, switching a little bit, and again, these are aspects of just from a brain basis, like I was talking about. Remember how some of our responses to trauma are not conscious, and our body gets out of balance and is more sensitized, where our heart rate goes up, and things are out of balance. And some of these things, some of these types of interventions can be helpful to put things back in balance. And again, these are, I'm again talking from not that I'm an expert, but just from more of a Lakota perspective. But I think it, different, looking at one's values and tribal diversity as well. But when we think of movement and exercise, again, it's those things maybe we can't always talk about. So when we think of, you may have heard of a treatment for trauma called EMDR, which is a rapid eye movement therapy. And the question is sort of, why does that, what are the theories behind why that helps? And my understanding, and there's a doctor, more of a researcher, I think, Dr. Huberman at Stanford, who has a lab that really looks a lot at eye movements and how our vision is linked to how we deal with trauma. But the thought behind this rapid eye movement therapy is that when we're out walking, we don't realize it, but our eyes are sort of our eyes are moving back and forth and sort of scanning, like if we're walking on a path, our eyes are sort of looking back and forth and scanning the path, and maybe looking for anything that, danger, whatever. But when we're out walking, we have to be aware of things, but to be aware of things, we also have to be somewhat calm. So there's this link between our eyes scanning the environment and actually calming that fear center of our brain, the amygdala, so that maybe people can't always go out walking, but if you replicate that eye movement, that actually calms some of the fear centers in the brain, that amygdala that's overreactive or overly sensitive. So that's one of the theories that why that eye movement therapy may be helpful, as Dr. Huberman explains it. But also movement, a number of studies have looked at just sort of exercise, movement, dance, can be quite helpful as well as sort of regulating some of those physical responses. And next slide. So another thing are breathing practices. So I was doing these right before the talk a little bit. And you know, I don't want to get so I'm so relaxed that you hear me snoring though. But and people say that they, you know, the way I talk, sometimes I speed up when I talk, but I talk sort of slow. Oh, can you hear? Are you able to, did something happen there? I see someone who can't hear. Are you able to hear me? Okay, good. I sometimes press this button and it mutes me. Okay. So I should say nachich umpi. Hey, can you all hear me? Or no, not namaich umpi. Hey. Yeah. Anyway, so breathing, we don't want to get so relaxed that we're, you know, I say my voice sort of puts people to sleep. So sorry. Breathing practices can be very important. And last time I reviewed a very special type of breathing practice by that same Dr. Huberman, who looked at this sort of idea of a physiologic sigh, where we take a deep breath and then we have a short, we take a deep breath with an extra inhale at the end. So we through our nose, we go, and then at the end, and then and doing that a number of times a day can really sort of reduce stress, that heart rate, those physical responses. Next. I'm going to sort of run through this a little bit. Locolia is Lakota language and aspects of how our language and communication can be healing. So this is more when we're able to talk about things, but I think for at least, you know, Lakota and other languages too, I think there's a healing aspect to those languages as far as how they're linked with our culture as well. I know personally, I just, it's been so helpful for me to, you know, the little Lakota that I speak, or the bad Lakota, not bad, but I don't speak very well, but the little Lakota I speak to connect, to be able to connect to people, to express myself, has really been helpful. So next slide. And we look at languages, native language use has been linked with better health. And this is just some initial studies looking at lower rates of smoking, diabetes, suicide, substance use. Some studies have shown this link. New slide. So in Lakota language, Locolia, this was a really pretty famous first language speaker, the Lakota teacher at Pine Ridge, said that one side of the brain deals with linear, mathematical, scientific. The other side deals with our passion, emotions, artistic, musical. But Lakota has the ability to be both simultaneously. So linking these emotions with our thoughts, you know, theoretically, one might be able to express themselves better too, not only is the language healing. New slide. And we look at differences in languages that are felt to be more relational, how words relate to one another. That's called morphological processing, I guess, in linguistics. There's actually brain differences in one study that showed that, you know, the right and left side of the brain are more linked to each other than in some of the, like comparing it to one of the Germanic language or German. Just a study sort of suggesting that is a little bit of a theory. New slide. And this is really a neat, if you get a chance to listen to, this is by Sierra Concha, and it was a recent talk through the Indigenous Language Institute in Santa Fe. And it was called Waking Up, Finding My Path Through Lakota Yapi, which is Lakota language by Sierra Concha. And it's I think you can find it on YouTube, but it's really great. And she is a Lakota teacher for immersion school in Pine Ridge. And she did a graduate research thesis on sort of the impact of language in the students. And some of the things that the students said in this sort of qualitative sort of when she was asking about stuff, they generally said that at school, the Lakota language helps and culture helps keep them safe, which is really a neat thing because we think for a lot of Lakota people, school isn't really a safe place, certainly boarding schools. And it helped with cultural identity and self-worth. And they said they were good enough, or they had self-worth because they knew they were Lakota. I had a friend who is learning to speak, speaking Lakota, like sort of beginner like I am, and he said, how lucky I am to be born Lakota. He said, and it was so nice to hear that from people. And the students also said, pride and community. They said they show pride in their Lakota by just speaking Lakota anywhere. They said, and that made them link their community too. Next slide. I also want to end by wind down here. I know we're running out of time, but that Red Wing Thomas at the Santee School, that's the I don't know, Dakota people in Santee and northeast Nebraska by Niobrara there. He's a teacher, a language teacher and cultural teacher there, and the high school there almost hit 100% or hit 100% perfect graduation rate. And really a big part of this seems to be the language and culture. And Red Wing Thomas said, we have generational trauma, and it's not told as a story of sorrow or sadness, but one of strength, said Red Wing Thomas. We've survived so much, and what we teach is this is our story of how we persevere. New slide. So Lukubu Chohan Kin Tokata Kia Gluha Ma Uni Pikdalo will carry the Lakota traditions into the future. I just wanted to take a second and review just a few things really quickly. Recognizing emotional and physical reactions to trauma can help us gain control. We spent time talking about understanding native or traditional cultural context in healing, drumming, music, restoring self-regulation, using cultural context in incorporating that into therapy or even trauma-focused therapy approaches to CBT. It could be, an aspect of that. We're trying to build an ability to calm our learned reactions to images and sounds that may trigger traumatic memories. So we're looking at how sort of we calm those through breathing techniques. And we also, trauma can affect, how we think, affect our memory and our negative narrative, and really trying to reframe these by different approaches. So thank you. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Copeland. It was an amazing presentation. I'm Livia Davis. I am privileged to be honored and be able to just facilitate some reflections with you for a few minutes during this portion of our time together. We did see that you had some comments, some reflections, and some questions in the chat box. And there is one question, and Dr. Copeland, I will just maybe ask you to answer that, and then I'll see if there's any other reflections that people want to share. So Ellen had said early in the presentation, if there's a way that you could explain the difference of Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, or tribes in the region that you talked about.
Sure. So the simple way, Ochete Shakoin, the 7 council fires, there's Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. And as Lakota, we're a subset. The languages are almost the same. I mean, they're the same people. People ask me, they say, in Dakota, they say, Dani Kota he, are you Dakota? And I say, how? Ma Lakota. Yes, I'm Lakota. So I answer yes to that. So the languages are very, very similar. There are a little bit of difference. But you know, there's a little bit more Dakota people here in Minnesota. There's Ihanktawan, Dakota, Yankton, Nakota are a little bit more north. Language is the same people, but language is a little bit different. I don't speak to Nakota people, and others can answer, but language is a little bit different there with some different words. But yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing so many examples of culture as health. We have to close with our beautiful music that's coming up in just 30 seconds. Thank you so much, and please keep the reflections and questions coming in the chat box. Blessings.
Thank you, Dr. Copeland. Have a good day, everybody.